In March 1844, the slave ship Esperanza docked at the port of Havana, Cuba, with 53 fewer enslaved Africans than when it departed from the West African coast. The ship's manifest listed 312 souls, 156 identified as members of the crew tribe, described in the captain's notes as cannibals and warriors of extreme danger. The official report submitted to Spanish colonial authorities made no mention of the missing 53. The ship's hull bore deep scratches from the inside, and the crew refused to speak about the voyage. When investigators finally examined the hold, they found dried blood on the walls, broken shackles, and what appeared to be human teeth marks on wooden beams. The captain's private journal, discovered years later, contained only one entry about the missing. They were never aboard. If you're watching this story unfold, leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is right now. And if you want to uncover more hidden truths like this one, subscribe to the channel. There are stories the world tried to bury, but we refuse to let them stay forgotten. The Esperanza belonged to the Mendoza Trading Company, one of the most respected merchant firms operating between Spain, Cuba, and the West African coast during the early 1840s. Founded in 1802 by Don Rafael Mendoza, a Spanish nobleman with connections to the royal court, the company had built its fortune on sugar, tobacco, and what they publicly called labor acquisition services. By 1844, the transatlantic slave trade had been officially abolished by most European powers, including Spain, which had signed treaties with Britain in 1817 and 1835 prohibiting the traffic of enslaved Africans. Yet the demand for labor in Cuban sugar plantations remained insatiable. The Mendoza Company operated in the gray zone between legality and criminality, using falsified documents, bribed officials, and ships registered under multiple flags. Don Rafael Mendoza himself was a prominent figure in Havana society. He funded churches, sponsored cultural events, and maintained a mansion on the Paseo del Prado. His eldest son, Don Cristobal Mendoza, managed the company's operations from their offices near the harbor. The family presented themselves as legitimate merchants, and few dared to question the source of their wealth. The Esperanza was captained by Joaquin Salazar, a veteran of 23 transatlantic voyages. Salazar had a reputation for efficiency. His ships rarely lost more than 10% of their human cargo to disease or rebellion, a rate considered exceptional in the trade. He was known among slave traders as El Silencioso, because he never spoke about his methods, never boasted in taverns, and never left witnesses to his practices. In January 1844, the Esperanza departed Havana for the coast of present-day Liberia, carrying manufactured goods, rum, and firearms to trade for enslaved people. The ship's official manifest listed the destination as Commercial Trade Mission to West Africa. No mention of human cargo appeared in any document filed with Spanish authorities. The crew people, who inhabited the coastal regions of Liberia, were known throughout West Africa as skilled sailors, fishermen, and fierce warriors. European traders both feared and sought them. The crew had a reputation for resistance. They rarely submitted to enslavement willingly, and when captured they were considered dangerous cargo. Rumors circulated among slave ship crews that the crew practiced cannibalism and possessed supernatural strength. Captain Salazar arrived at the crew coast in February 1844. According to the ship's official log, he negotiated with local intermediaries and European agents operating illegal barracoons, temporary holding pens where captured Africans were imprisoned before being loaded onto ships. The log recorded the acquisition of 312 individuals over a period of 3 weeks. What the official log did not record was how Salazar obtained so many crew captives. The crew were not typically sold by neighboring tribes, and they violently resisted capture. Later testimonies from crew members who survived the voyage suggested that Salazar had made a deal with a rogue faction of crew warriors who had captured members of rival clans during internal conflicts. The ship's surgeon, Dr. Emilio Vargas, kept a separate medical log. His entries from February 1844 described the captives as unusually strong and resistant to restraint. He noted that several had filed their teeth to points, a practice he associated with savage customs. Dr. Vargas recommended increased security measures and suggested separating the crew captives from other enslaved Africans aboard the ship. On February 28, 1844, the Esperanza departed the African coast with 312 enslaved people shackled in the hold. The ship's manifest listed them by estimated age, sex, and tribal origin. Beside 156 names, Captain Salazar had written a single word in Spanish: crew. Beside that word, in smaller script, he had added peligro extremo, extreme danger. The voyage from West Africa to Cuba typically took 6 to 8 weeks, depending on weather and currents. The Esperanza was equipped with reinforced holds, extra chains, and a crew of 42 men, including armed guards whose sole responsibility was to prevent rebellion. The ship carried enough food and water for a 2-month journey, calculated to keep the captives alive but weak. The Mendoza Company's reputation depended on delivering healthy, controllable laborers to Cuban plantations. Don Cristobal Mendoza had personally instructed Captain Salazar to ensure the crew captives arrived, subdued and ready for sale. The company had already received advance payments from 3 plantation owners who specifically requested strong field workers. As the Esperanza sailed into the Atlantic, the crew followed standard procedures. The enslaved were kept below deck in chains, allowed on deck in small groups for brief periods, and fed twice daily with minimal rations. The crew captives were kept in a separate section of the hold, double-chained, and never brought on deck together. Dr. Vargas's medical log from the first week of the voyage noted unusual silence among the crew captives. Unlike other enslaved Africans who often wept, sang, or spoke to each other, the crew remained quiet. The ship's guards reported that the crew captives stared at them without expression, never looked away, and seemed to be waiting for something. On March 7, 1844, 9 days into the voyage, Dr. Vargas recorded the first death. A crewman, approximately 30 years old, found dead in his chains. The cause of death was listed as unknown. The body was thrown overboard, as was standard practice. The doctor noted that the other crew captives showed no reaction to the death. They simply watched as the body was removed. The Esperanza continued its journey across the Atlantic. Captain Salazar maintained his reputation for silence. He gave no indication that anything aboard his ship was different from any of his previous 23 voyages. The crew followed orders. The Mendoza Company awaited the ship's arrival in Havana, where buyers were already preparing to inspect the cargo. But in the hold of the Esperanza, something was happening that no official log would ever record. The first sign that something was wrong came on March 10, 1844, 12 days into the voyage. The night watch reported hearing sounds from the hold that were different from the usual moans and cries of the enslaved. The guard on duty, a man named Vicente Ruiz, described it in his testimony years later as a rhythmic tapping, like a code being transmitted through the wooden walls. Captain Salazar dismissed the report. He ordered the guards to increase patrols but took no other action. The ship continued on its course. The tapping continued every night, always between midnight and dawn, always in the same rhythm. The crew began to grow uneasy, but no one dared question the captain's authority. On March 12th, Dr. Vargas recorded the second death. Another crewman, found dead in his chains with no visible injuries. The doctor's notes indicated possible starvation, though the man had been fed the same rations as the others. When the body was removed, the other crew captives again showed no reaction. They simply watched in silence. The crew began to notice other strange occurrences. Tools went missing from the deck, a hammer, a chisel, a length of rope. The ship's carpenter reported that someone had tampered with the locks on the hold's access hatches, though they remained secure. Captain Salazar ordered a search of the hold, but nothing was found. The missing tools were never recovered. On March 15th, 18 days into the voyage, the ship encountered a storm. The Esperanza was built to withstand Atlantic weather, and the crew worked efficiently to secure the vessel. During the storm, the guards were pulled from their posts in the hold to assist on deck. For approximately 3 hours, the enslaved Africans were left unattended below. When the storm passed and the guards returned to their posts, they found that several chains in the crew section had been loosened, not broken, but loosened, as if someone had been working on them systematically. The guards reported this to Captain Salazar, who ordered the chains reinforced and doubled the watch. He still made no entry in the official log. Dr. Vargas recorded the third death on March 17th. A crew woman, approximately 25 years old, found dead with no apparent cause. The doctor noted in his private journal, discovered decades later, that he was beginning to suspect the deaths were not natural. He wrote, "The bodies show no signs of disease, no wounds, no struggle. It is as if they simply chose to stop living." The crew's unease grew into fear. Sailors began to refuse night watch duty in the hold. They spoke in whispers about curses and African magic. Captain Salazar responded with discipline. He flogged 2 men for spreading superstitious nonsense and threatened to throw anyone who refused duty overboard. The crew obeyed, but the fear remained. On March 20th, 23 days into the voyage, a guard named Paulo Mendez reported seeing movement in the crew section during his night watch. He claimed that despite the chains, several of the crew captives were sitting upright, facing each other, moving their hands in coordinated gestures. When he approached with his lantern, they immediately lay back down and closed their eyes. Mendez reported this to the first mate, who dismissed it as exhaustion and imagination. The tapping continued every night. The rhythm never changed. Some crew members claimed they could hear voices beneath the tapping, speaking in a language none of them understood. Others reported seeing scratches appearing on the wooden walls of the hold, though no one ever witnessed them being made. On March 23rd, Dr. Vargas recorded the 4th and 5th deaths. 2 crewmen found dead in adjacent positions. The doctor's notes indicated growing alarm. "I cannot explain these deaths. The bodies are healthy. There is no disease aboard this ship. Yet they continue to die, always the crew, always without struggle." Captain Salazar finally made an entry in his private journal on March 24th. The entry was brief. "The cargo is diminishing. The crew are a mistake. We should have left them on the coast." He made no official report to the Mendoza Company. He did not alter course. He did not increase rations or improve conditions. He simply noted the problem and continued the voyage. The crew began to notice that the crew captives who remained alive were changing. They appeared thinner but not weaker. Their eyes seemed brighter. They moved less, but when they did move, it was with disturbing coordination. The guards reported that when they brought food, all the crew captives would turn their heads at exactly the same moment, as if responding to a signal no one else could hear. On March 27th, 30 days into the voyage, the ship's carpenter discovered that someone had been systematically weakening the support beams in the crew section of the hold. The wood had been scraped and gnawed, not with tools, but with something else. The carpenter showed the damage to Captain Salazar, who ordered immediate repairs. The captain's only comment was, "Work quickly." The deaths continued. Dr. Vargas recorded 6 more between March 28th and April 2nd, 4 men and 2 women, all crew, all without apparent cause. The doctor stopped trying to determine causes of death. He simply recorded the numbers and threw the bodies overboard. In his private journal he wrote, "I believe they are killing themselves deliberately, but I cannot prove it and I cannot stop it." The crew began to hear new sounds from the hold, not tapping, but something that sounded like chewing. The guards refused to investigate. When Captain Salazar ordered them below, they went in groups of 4 armed with pistols and clubs, and they never stayed longer than necessary. None of them reported what they saw, but their faces told the story. On April 5th, 39 days into the voyage, the first mate reported to Captain Salazar that the ship's food stores were being depleted faster than expected. An inventory revealed that someone had been stealing rations, dried meat, hardtack, and water. The first mate suggested the crew was responsible, but Captain Salazar knew better. He ordered the hold sealed, except for feeding times. He posted armed guards at every access point. He said nothing about what he suspected. The Esperanza was now less than 2 weeks from Havana. The crew counted the days. The crew captives, those who remained alive, had stopped making any sound at all. They lay in their chains, silent and still, their eyes open, watching the darkness. The guards reported that they no longer seemed human. They seemed to be waiting. On April 8th, Dr. Vargas recorded the 15th death. He had stopped writing detailed notes. His entries were now single lines. Another crew male, no cause. The bodies continued to go overboard. The ship continued toward Cuba. And in the hold, in the section where the crew captives were chained, something was happening that no one aboard the Esperanza wanted to acknowledge. The signs were no longer being ignored. They were being deliberately suppressed. Because to acknowledge them would be to admit that Captain Salazar, the Mendoza Company, and everyone involved in the voyage had made a terrible mistake. They had brought something aboard the Esperanza that should have been left in Africa. And now, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, with nowhere to run and no way to turn back, they were going to pay for that mistake. The truth about what happened aboard the Esperanza began to emerge on April 10, 1844, 44 days into the voyage, when the ship was approximately 5 days from Havana. That morning, when the guards opened the hold to distribute the daily rations, they found that 12 of the crew captives were missing. Not dead. Missing. The chains that had held them were still locked. The shackles were still closed. But the captives were gone. The guards searched the entire hold, moving through the cramped, dark space with lanterns and weapons. They found nothing. 12 human beings had vanished from a locked hold in the middle of the ocean. Captain Salazar ordered an immediate search of the entire ship. Every deck, every storage area, every possible hiding place was examined. The crew worked in a state of panic, expecting at any moment to be attacked by the missing crew. But they found nothing. No bodies, no blood, no evidence that the 12 had ever existed except for the empty chains. Dr. Vargas examined the shackles. In his private journal, he wrote, "The iron shows no signs of being forced or broken. The locks are intact, yet the captives are gone. I can offer no rational explanation." He examined the remaining crew captives and noted that they appeared healthier and stronger than they should be, given the conditions and rations. The first mate, a man named Diego Ortiz, reported to Captain Salazar that several crew members were demanding the ship turn back or make for the nearest port. Salazar refused. He ordered the hold sealed and doubled the armed guard. He made no entry in the official log. In his private journal, he wrote only, "We are 5 days from Havana. We will make port. God help us." That night the crew heard screaming from the hold, not the usual cries of the enslaved, but something different, high-pitched, agonized, and brief. When the guards opened the hold at dawn on April 11th, they found 3 more crew captives missing. In their place they found something else, the body of a crew member. His name was Tomas Ruiz, a sailor who had been on night watch. He was found in the crew section of the hold, his body positioned where one of the missing captives had been chained. His throat had been torn open. The guards reported that the remaining crew captives were sitting upright, watching them, and several had blood on their mouths and hands. Captain Salazar ordered the hold sealed immediately. He assembled the crew on deck and announced that any man who entered the hold without direct orders would be shot. He ordered the ship to increase speed. He sent no distress signals. He made no attempt to investigate Tomas Ruiz's death. He simply ordered the body thrown overboard and the voyage continued. Dr. Vargas refused to examine the body before it was disposed of. In his journal he wrote, "I know what killed him. We all know. But to speak it aloud would be to admit that we have lost control of this ship. Salazar believes we can reach Havana before it happens again. I do not share his optimism." The crew began to fracture. Some wanted to mutiny and take control of the ship. Others wanted to kill all the remaining captives in the hold. A few wanted to abandon ship in the lifeboats. Captain Salazar maintained order through violence. He shot one man who attempted to organize a mutiny and had 2 others flogged for refusing duty. The crew obeyed, but barely. On April 12th, 46 days into the voyage, the guards reported hearing movement in the hold throughout the night. Not the usual sounds of the enslaved, but coordinated movement, as if a large group was working together on something. Captain Salazar ordered the hold to remain sealed. No one was to enter for any reason. The enslaved Africans, both crew and non-crew, would receive no food or water until the ship reached Havana. That decision proved fatal. On the night of April 12th, the crew heard sounds from the hold that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Witnesses described it as the sound of wood being torn apart from the inside. The guards reported that the hold's access hatches were shaking, as if something was trying to break through. Captain Salazar ordered all crew to arm themselves and prepare for an attack. The attack never came. Instead, at approximately 3 a.m. on April 13th, the sounds stopped. The ship fell silent. The crew waited on deck, weapons ready, staring at the sealed hatches. Nothing happened. As dawn broke, Captain Salazar ordered the first mate and 4 armed guards to open the hold and investigate. What they found was documented in testimony given years later by Diego Ortiz, the first mate, who survived the voyage and eventually spoke to investigators. His account was corroborated by 2 other surviving crew members. The hold had been transformed. The wooden walls bore deep gouges and scratches. The support beams had been systematically weakened. The chains that had held the crew captives were empty, not broken but opened, as if someone had found keys or learned to pick the locks. Of the 156 crew captives who had been loaded in Africa, only 103 remained. 53 were missing. The non-crew captives, approximately 156 people from other tribes, were found huddled in the far corner of the hold, as far from the crew section as possible. They were alive but terrified. When the guards tried to approach them, they screamed and tried to hide. Several were injured with bite marks and scratches. None would speak about what they had witnessed. The remaining 103 crew captives were found sitting in organized rows, unchained, calm, and watching the guards with what Diego Ortiz described as patient expectation. They made no attempt to attack. They made no attempt to escape. They simply sat and waited. Dr. Vargas was ordered to examine the hold. His report, discovered in Spanish colonial archives in 1923, described what he found. Evidence of cannibalism. Human remains, partially consumed, hidden beneath the floorboards. Bones showing marks consistent with human teeth. The crew captives appear well-fed and healthy, despite having received minimal rations for weeks. Captain Salazar made a decision that would define the rest of the voyage. He ordered the guards to rechain the crew captives, separate them completely from the other enslaved Africans, and seal that section of the hold with reinforced barriers. He ordered increased rations for the crew, believing that feeding them would prevent further violence. He made no official report of the missing 53. In his private journal he wrote, "They were never aboard." The Esperanza continued toward Havana. The crew worked in silence, avoiding eye contact, speaking only when necessary. The non-crew captives in the hold were given food and water, but many refused to eat. Several died of shock and terror in the final days of the voyage. Dr. Vargas stopped keeping medical records. He spent his time in his cabin drinking rum and writing in his journal. On April 15th, 2 days from Havana, the crew heard singing from the hold. Not the mournful songs typical of enslaved Africans, but something else, rhythmic, coordinated, in a language none of them recognized. The singing continued throughout the night. Captain Salazar ordered the crew to ignore it. The singing stopped at dawn. On April 16th, the day before the ship was scheduled to reach Havana, Captain Salazar assembled his crew and gave them their final orders. They were to say nothing about the missing 53. They were to report that the voyage had been routine. They were to claim that any deaths had been due to disease, which was common on slave ships. Anyone who spoke the truth would be killed. The crew agreed. They had no choice. Diego Ortiz later testified that on that final night, he went below deck against orders and looked through a gap in the sealed section where the crew captives were held. He saw them sitting in rows, calm and silent, their eyes reflecting the lamplight. He saw bones stacked neatly in the corner. He saw blood on the walls. And he saw something else that he refused to describe in his testimony, saying only, "I saw what they had become, and I understood why they had done it." On April 17, 1844, the Esperanza arrived in Havana harbor. The ship docked without incident. Spanish colonial authorities boarded for routine inspection. Captain Salazar presented the ship's manifest, which listed 312 enslaved Africans. When asked about the condition of the cargo, he reported acceptable losses due to disease and provided a revised count of 259 survivors. The inspectors noted the discrepancy, but did not investigate further. Such losses were common on slave ships, and the Mendoza Company had the necessary bribes and connections to avoid scrutiny. The ship was cleared for unloading. The surviving enslaved Africans were taken to the company's barracoon in Havana to be cleaned, fed, and prepared for sale. The 103 crew captives were kept separate from the others. Don Cristobal Mendoza personally inspected them and noted in his business records that they were in excellent physical condition, unusually strong and healthy. He made arrangements to sell them to 3 different plantation owners, ensuring they would be separated and unable to communicate with each other. The crew of the Esperanza was paid and dismissed. Captain Salazar received his commission and retired from the slave trade. He never captained another ship. Dr. Vargas returned to Spain and never practiced medicine again. The first mate, Diego Ortiz, disappeared into the slums of Havana and became an alcoholic. The official record of the voyage listed 259 enslaved Africans delivered to Havana. The missing 53 were never mentioned in any document filed with Spanish authorities. The Mendoza Company recorded the voyage as profitable and successful. The buyers received their purchases and transported them to plantations across Cuba. And in the hold of the Esperanza, which was cleaned and prepared for another voyage, workers found evidence that would never be officially reported: human bones hidden in the walls, teeth marks on the wooden beams, scratches that formed patterns, as if someone had been keeping count, and a smell that no amount of cleaning could remove. The ship was eventually scuttled in 1847, 3 years after the voyage, for reasons the Mendoza Company never explained. The hull was burned before it sank. No one was allowed to salvage anything from the wreckage. The truth about what happened aboard the Esperanza remained hidden for decades, but the survivors knew. The crew members who lived carried the knowledge until their deaths. And the 103 crew captives who were sold into slavery in Cuba carried something else: the memory of what they had done to survive, and the knowledge that 53 of their people had sacrificed themselves so that the others might live. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave your rating in the comments. From 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world has tried to forget, but we insist on remembering. The 103 crew survivors who arrived in Havana on April 17, 1844, were sold within 3 weeks of their arrival. Don Cristobal Mendoza, following his father's instructions, ensured they were distributed across 3 separate plantations, each located in different regions of Cuba. The buyers were Don Fernando Alvarez, owner of the Santa Rosa sugar plantation in Matanzas, Don Luis Herrera, who operated the San Miguel estate near Trinidad, and Doña Isabel Cortés, a widow who managed the vast La Esperanza plantation in Pinar del Rio. The separation was deliberate. The Mendoza Company had learned from previous experiences that enslaved Africans from the same tribe, when kept together, were more likely to organize resistance or escape attempts. By scattering the crew survivors across hundreds of miles, the company believed it could prevent any coordinated action and erase the memory of what had happened aboard the ship. But the Mendoza Company underestimated what the crew had become during that voyage. Within 6 months of their arrival, all 3 plantations reported unusual incidents. At Santa Rosa, 35 crew workers were assigned to the most brutal labor, cutting sugarcane in the fields from dawn until dusk. The overseers noted in their reports that the crew never complained, never showed weakness, and worked with mechanical efficiency. But they also noted something disturbing. The crew refused to eat the standard rations provided to enslaved workers. The overseer, a man named Vicente Mora, reported to Don Fernando Alvarez that the crew were somehow obtaining their own food. Mora conducted searches of their quarters and found nothing. Yet the crew remained healthy and strong, even as other enslaved workers weakened from malnutrition and disease. Mora wrote in his report, discovered in plantation archives in 1891, "They eat something, but I cannot determine what. They are never sick. They never weaken. It is unnatural." At the San Miguel estate, the 34 crew workers were housed in a separate barracoon, isolated from the other enslaved Africans. Don Luis Herrera had specifically requested this arrangement, having been warned by the Mendoza Company that the crew were difficult cargo. Within 3 months, the other enslaved workers on the plantation began refusing to go near the crew barracoon after dark. The plantation's head overseer, Ramon Delgado, investigated and found that the other enslaved Africans believed the crew were practicing dark magic. Several claimed to have seen the crew performing rituals at night, speaking in their language, and making marks on the walls of their quarters. Delgado dismissed these claims as superstition, but he noted in his records that he himself had observed the crew communicating without speaking, as if they share one mind. At La Esperanza plantation in Pinar del Rio, Doña Isabel Cortez purchased 34 crew workers to replace enslaved laborers who had died during the previous harvest. Cortez was known as a particularly cruel owner, employing brutal overseers and maintaining harsh discipline. She believed that fear and violence were the only effective methods of control. The crew workers at La Esperanza were subjected to regular beatings, inadequate food, and punishing labor schedules. Yet within weeks, the overseers reported that the crew showed no signs of breaking. They worked without complaint, healed from injuries with unusual speed, and maintained their strength despite the conditions. Cortez ordered increased punishments, but nothing changed. The crew simply endured. By October 1844, 6 months after the Esperanza arrived in Havana, the first disappearances began. At Santa Rosa Plantation, 3 enslaved workers from other tribes vanished during the night. They were housed in the same barracoon as the crew workers. The overseers conducted a search and found no trace of them. The plantation's records listed them as escaped, though no one could explain how they had gotten past the guards and dogs. The crew workers, when questioned, said nothing. 2 weeks later, 2 more workers disappeared from Santa Rosa, then 3 more. By December 1844, 12 enslaved Africans had vanished from the plantation. Don Fernando Alvarez ordered an investigation, but the investigators found nothing. The disappearances stopped as suddenly as they had begun. The crew workers continued their labor, silent and efficient. At San Miguel Estate, the pattern was similar. Between September and November 1844, 8 enslaved workers disappeared. The plantation's records noted that all of them had been housed near the crew barracoon. Don Luis Herrera ordered the crew moved to a more isolated location, but the damage was done. The other enslaved workers refused to work alongside the crew, claiming they were cursed or possessed by demons. At La Esperanza plantation, Doña Isabel Cortez faced a different problem. The crew workers were not causing disappearances, but they were causing fear. The other enslaved Africans began to whisper that the crew were the ones who ate their own, and that they would do the same to anyone who came too close. Cortez ordered the crew whipped for spreading fear, but the whippings had no effect. The crew accepted the punishment without reaction and returned to work. In January 1845, 9 months after the voyage of the Esperanza, the Mendoza Company received reports from all 3 plantations describing problems with the crew workers. Don Cristobal Mendoza reviewed the reports and made a decision that would seal the company's fate. He ordered all records of the crew purchase destroyed. The company's ledgers were altered to remove any mention of the 103 crew survivors. The ship's manifest was burned. The crew members who had served aboard the Esperanza were paid substantial sums to remain silent. Captain Joaquin Salazar, who had retired to a small estate outside Havana, received a visit from Don Cristobal Mendoza in February 1845. The 2 men met privately, and no record exists of their conversation. But 3 days later, Salazar's estate burned to the ground. Salazar's body was found in the ruins. The official cause of death was listed as accidental fire. His private journal, which contained the only written account of what had happened aboard the Esperanza, was never recovered. Dr. Emilio Vargas, who had returned to Spain, died in March 1845 under mysterious circumstances. He was found dead in his home in Seville, apparently from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. His medical journals and personal papers were confiscated by Spanish authorities and disappeared into colonial archives, where they remained hidden for 78 years. Diego Ortiz, the first mate who had given testimony about the voyage, vanished from Havana in April 1845. his body was never found. The two other crew members who had corroborated his account died within weeks of each other, one from a knife wound in a tavern fight, the other from a fall from a dock. Both deaths were ruled accidental. By mid-1845, everyone who had direct knowledge of what happened aboard the Esperanza was dead, silent, or disappeared. The Mendoza Company continued its operations, though it quietly withdrew from the slave trade and focused on legitimate commerce. Don Rafael Mendoza died in 1847, and his son Cristobal took full control of the company. The family's wealth and reputation remained intact, but the crew survivors remained on the plantations, and their presence continued to cause problems. At Santa Rosa Plantation, Don Fernando Alvarez made a decision in 1846 to sell all 35 crew workers to a plantation in the eastern part of Cuba, far from his estate. The sale was conducted quietly, with no public auction. The buyers were not told about the workers' history. Alvarez recorded the sale in his private papers with a single note: "Good riddance to cursed cargo." At San Miguel Estate, Don Luis Herrera took a different approach. In 1847, he ordered the 34 crew workers moved to the most remote section of his plantation, where they were assigned to work in isolation from all other enslaved laborers. Herrera's instructions to his overseers were explicit: feed them, work them, but never let them near the others. And never ask them questions. At La Esperanza Plantation, Doña Isabel Cortés attempted to break the crew workers through increasingly brutal punishments. Between 1845 and 1848, she ordered multiple whippings, brandings, and other tortures. The crew endured everything without breaking. In 1848, Cortés ordered them sold, but no buyers could be found. Word had spread among plantation owners that the crew from the Esperanza were bad luck. The crew survivors lived and worked on Cuban plantations for decades. Some died from disease, accidents, or old age. Others simply disappeared, their fates unrecorded. A few lived long enough to see the abolition of slavery in Cuba in 1886, 42 years after their arrival. In the 1880s, a Cuban historian named Alejandro Ruiz began researching the history of the slave trade in Cuba. He discovered references to the Esperanza in colonial shipping records and became curious about the voyage. He tracked down descendants of the Mendoza family, former plantation owners, and elderly Cubans who remembered stories about the cursed crew. Ruiz's research led him to discover Dr. Vargas's medical journals in the Spanish colonial archives in 1923. The journals had been misfiled and forgotten for decades. When Ruiz read the entries describing the voyage, he understood why the Mendoza Company had tried so hard to erase the evidence. Ruiz attempted to publish his findings, but he faced immediate opposition. The descendants of the Mendoza family, still wealthy and influential in Cuba, threatened legal action. The Spanish government, embarrassed by revelations about the illegal slave trade, refused to cooperate with his research. Cuban authorities, concerned about social unrest, discouraged him from publishing anything that might inflame racial tensions. Ruiz published a limited edition of his research in 1925, printing only 50 copies. The book, titled The Forgotten Cargo, The True Story of the Esperanza, was immediately suppressed. Most copies were destroyed. Only 3 are known to survive, held in private collections. The descendants of the crew survivors, scattered across Cuba and other parts of the Caribbean, carried oral histories of what their ancestors had endured. These stories were passed down through generations, but they were never written down, never officially recorded. The descendants knew that their ancestors had survived something terrible, that they had done something unthinkable to stay alive, and that they had been punished for it even after reaching land. In the 1960s, a Liberian anthropologist named Dr. Samuel Coffer conducted research into the history of the crew people who had been enslaved and transported to the Americas. He interviewed descendants in Cuba, Jamaica, and other Caribbean islands. Many refused to speak about their ancestors' experiences. Those who did speak told stories that matched the accounts in Dr. Vargas's journals and Alejandro Ruiz's research. Dr. Coffer's research was never published. He died in 1967, and his notes were lost. But he had shared his findings with colleagues, and fragments of his work survived in academic circles. Those fragments confirmed what historians had long suspected. The voyage of the Esperanza was not unique. Similar incidents had occurred on other slave ships, but they had been systematically covered up by traders, plantation owners, and colonial authorities. The truth about the 53 missing crew captives was never officially acknowledged. No investigation was ever conducted. No one was ever held accountable. The Mendoza Company dissolved in 1889, and its records were destroyed. The plantations where the crew survivors worked changed hands multiple times, and their records were lost or deliberately destroyed. Today, the story of the Esperanza exists only in fragments. A few pages from Dr. Vargas's journal, testimony from Diego Ortiz, preserved in colonial archives, references in Alejandro Ruiz's suppressed book, and oral histories passed down through generations of descendants. The ship itself was destroyed in 1847, its hull burned and sunk, ensuring that no physical evidence would remain. The legacy of the voyage is a silence that spans generations. A silence maintained by those who profited from the slave trade, enforced by those who wanted to forget, and endured by those who survived. The 53 crew captives who disappeared during the voyage have no graves, no memorials, no official recognition of their existence. They are remembered only in the stories their descendants tell, stories that speak of sacrifice, survival, and the terrible price of both. The Esperanza made only one voyage carrying enslaved Africans, but that single voyage revealed a truth that the architects of the slave trade desperately wanted to hide, that the system they had created was so brutal, so dehumanizing, so utterly evil, that it could drive human beings to commit acts that would haunt their descendants for generations. The crew survivors who lived to see freedom in 1886 never spoke publicly about what had happened aboard the ship. They carried their secrets to their graves, but they passed something else to their children and grandchildren. A warning. A reminder that survival sometimes requires choices that can never be undone, and that the consequences of those choices echo through time. The world tried to forget the Esperanza. The records were destroyed, the witnesses silenced, the evidence erased. But the truth survived in whispers, in fragments, in the memories of those who refused to let it die. And now, more than 180 years later, the story can finally be told. Not as justification, not as glorification, but as testimony to what human beings endured under slavery and what they were forced to become in order to survive. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave your rating in the comments. From 0 to 10, how would you rate this story? And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world has tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.